Constance Albright received the phone call about the cabin. On the same afternoon, her husband's lawyer sent the final asset division summary by email. The timing was not poetic. It was simply the timing. The way that two things arrived in the same afternoon without any arrangement between them. And Constance sat at the kitchen table of her daughter's spare room in the small town of Harker Falls and read the email first and then answered the phone. And the two things together produced a quality of compressed experience that she would think about later as the afternoon when one chapter closed so completely that the sound of it closing was still in the air when the next one began. The email was from Richard Mallory, who was Leon's lawyer, and who had been Leon's lawyer for 19 years, which meant he had been the lawyer for the 19 years of their marriage, simultaneously, without Constance ever fully registering that this was what he was, Leon's lawyer rather than their lawyer. The distinction that had seemed irrelevant through 19 years of apparent partnership, and had become the most relevant distinction in the world over the past 14 months of divorce proceedings. The asset division summary was 6 pages long and described, in the organized columns of a financial document, what 22 years of two people's working and saving and building looked like when it was formally divided. Constance had married Leon at 50, which meant she had brought to the marriage the 30 years of financial life she had built as a single woman, the savings and the investments and the ownership stake in the small accounting firm she had worked at for 18 years. Leon had brought his real estate business, which was considerably larger, and the specific confidence of a man who was accustomed to transactions and understood, which Constance had not fully understood at 50, that the terms of any transaction were set by whoever had the greater knowledge of how transactions worked. She had trusted him. That was the essential fact of 19 years, described in 4 words. She had trusted him with the financial management of their shared life in the way that people trusted people they loved with the things they were good at. And Leon had been good at financial management in the specific way of someone for whom financial management was the primary language of power, rather than a practical tool. The accounts had been reorganized over the 19 years in ways that were each individually reasonable and collectively produced a situation that Richard Mallory's 6-page document now described with the composed neutrality of a man who had helped arrange the situation and was now documenting its outcome. She had come out of 19 years with the contents of her personal checking account, her car, her clothing, and a settlement figure that her own lawyer had fought for, and that was considerably less than what 30 years of her working life had contributed to the marriage, and considerably more than what Richard Mallory's initial position had offered. Her personal checking account contained $212. She read the email to the end. Then she put the phone down on the table and looked at the wall of her daughter's spare room, which had a print on it of a coastal scene and a small bookshelf, and the specific neutrality of a room that had been set up for guests and had not been anyone's room in the particular way that rooms became someone's room through the accumulation of daily life in them. Her daughter Rebecca was at work. She would be home at 6. Rebecca had told Constance 3 times that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed to, and had meant it with the genuine warmth of a daughter who loved her mother. And Constance had accepted the offer with the genuine gratitude of a woman who needed somewhere to be and the specific discomfort of a woman who had spent 30 years being entirely self-sufficient and found the resumption of dependence, even temporary and welcome dependence, a condition that sat uneasily in her. The phone rang. She answered it because she was sitting at the table with the phone in front of her, and answering it was what you did when phones rang. The caller identified himself as Gordon Fitch, which was a name she recognized because Gordon Fitch ran the community center in Harker Falls and had organized the winter fundraising raffle 3 months earlier that Rebecca had bought tickets for on her behalf as a Christmas present. 10 tickets at $2 each, and which Constance had forgotten about entirely in the months since. Gordon said he was calling to let her know that she had won the raffle. Constance said she was sorry. She had not been thinking about the raffle. Gordon said that was quite all right, and that she had won the primary prize, which was the cabin property on Spruce Lake Road that had been donated to the community center by the estate of a woman named Helen Marsh, who had owned it for 40 years, and who had specified in her estate instructions that the cabin should go to a community member through a process that felt like luck rather than transaction, which was why Helen had requested it be raffled rather than sold. Constance asked what the cabin was. Gordon said it was a single-story cabin of approximately 500 square feet on 1.5 acres adjacent to Spruce Lake. He said it had been unoccupied for the 3 years since Helen's health had required her to move to assisted living, and the subsequent 2 years since her death. He said he wanted to be honest because he preferred people to have accurate expectations, that the cabin was in the condition of something that had been loved for 40 years and then unoccupied for 5, and that reflected both of those things simultaneously. She said, "Was it standing?" He said it was standing. She said she accepted the prize. Gordon said he would send the paperwork to Rebecca's address and that the key was at the community center whenever she wanted to collect it. She put the phone down. She looked at the coastal print on the wall and the small bookshelf. She thought about $212 in a car and a spare room, and the 6-page document still on her phone screen. Then she thought about a cabin on Spruce Lake Road. She picked up the phone again and called Rebecca. Rebecca drove her to the cabin on Saturday morning, which was 3 days after Gordon's call and 2 days after the paperwork arrived, and 1 day after Constance had collected the key from the community center and held it in her hand for a moment before putting it in her coat pocket. Rebecca was 44 years old and had her mother's quality of practical attention, which was the quality that assessed situations accurately and moved to what was needed without requiring the situation to be different from what it was. She drove the 12 miles to Spruce Lake Road with the focused quiet of someone who understood that this was a significant morning, and that significance sometimes required the company of silence rather than conversation. Spruce Lake Road was a single-track road that ran along the eastern shore of a lake that was visible in sections through the pine trees, gray and flat in the early February morning, with the specific quality of water in winter, present and still. The cabin appeared at the end of a short track that left the road at a weathered post, partially hidden by the pine branches that had grown across the track entrance in the years since anyone had been using it regularly. Rebecca parked where the track widened. They got out. The cabin was small in the way that 500 square feet was small when you were standing in front of it rather than reading the number in a description, but it had a quality that numbers did not convey. the specific quality of a building that had been built in a place rather than placed in a place. The proportions and the materials reflecting the trees and the lake in a way that was the work of someone who had understood both building and landscape. The roof had moss along the north edge and was intact across the rest. The porch along the front face had a railing that needed attention, but was standing. The windows were present. The door in its frame was a solid timber door that resisted slightly when Constance used the key, and then opened with the particular sound of a door that had not been opened in a long time, and remembered what opening felt like. She went in. The interior of the cabin was Helen Marsh, in the specific way that the homes of people who have lived fully in their spaces carried the person, even after the person was gone. The main room with a wood-burning stove in the corner that had been used seriously and maintained with the care of someone who depended on it. A kitchen area along the back wall with a propane cooker and a hand pump at the sink. A bedroom at the far end, separated by a curtain rather than a wall. The bed frame and the wardrobe still in place. Bookshelves covering most of one wall, still full. A table with 2 chairs. The specific smell of a closed cabin, old wood and cold ash, and the mineral quality of a space that had been sealed against the world and was now being asked to open again. Rebecca stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly. She said it needed work. Constance said she knew. Rebecca said it also had something that new things did not have. Constance said she knew that too. She went to the bookshelves and looked at the titles. Helen Marsh had been a reader in the specific way of someone who read for the same reason they ate, because not reading was not an option. The books were dense and varied and organized in the way of a person who had a system she had developed over time and that reflected her thinking rather than any conventional arrangement. On the bottom shelf, beside a row of field guides and a collection of local history books, were 3 notebooks. Spiral-bound, the covers worn soft with handling, dates written on the spines in a handwriting she did not yet know, but would come to know over the following days. She pulled the first one. She read the opening page standing at the shelf. She read the second page. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the bookshelf and continued reading. Rebecca appeared beside her after a few minutes and looked at what she was reading. She asked what it was. Constance said she was not entirely sure yet, but that she was going to need some time. Rebecca sat on the floor beside her and waited, which was the right response, and which reflected the quality of her mother's attention in situations that required attention. Helen Marsh had been a botanical forager. That was the general description. The specific description, which emerged from the 3 notebooks over the 2 hours that Constance spent sitting on the floor of the cabin, reading them before she moved to the table and continued, was considerably more precise and considerably more significant than the general description suggested. Helen had spent 40 years on the 1.5 acres adjacent to Spruce Lake and the surrounding forest and wetland, identifying, cultivating, harvesting, and processing native plant species, with a knowledge and a rigor that was not the knowledge and rigor of an enthusiastic amateur. The notebooks documented her work in the specific technical language of someone who had educated herself thoroughly over decades and who had been in correspondence, the letters referenced throughout the notebooks, with researchers and botanists and herbalists whose names Constance did not recognize, but whose credentials were mentioned in ways they were people operating at a serious professional level. Helen had not published. She had written to Constance on the first page of the third notebook in a section that was addressed not to Helen herself, but to whoever came after, which Constance read with the specific attention of someone who understood they were being addressed directly across the years. Helen wrote that she had not published because publishing had required institutional affiliation, and institutional affiliation had required the compromise of her independence, and she had valued her independence above the recognition the publication would have provided. She wrote that she had 40 years of documented work on the specific native plant communities of the Spruce Lake area and the surrounding forest and wetland, including several compounds she had identified in regional species that she believed had not been studied with adequate attention by formal research. She wrote that she was leaving the notebooks and the cabin and the land to whoever came to it through the raffle she had arranged, because she believed that the right person would be someone who had not sought the thing specifically and would therefore come to it without the assumptions that seeking produced. She wrote that the work in the notebooks was complete and accurate, and that whoever found it should take it to someone who knew how to evaluate it properly, and should not be deterred by the format or the source from having it evaluated seriously. She wrote one more thing. She wrote that beneath the floorboards of the kitchen, under the fourth board from the stove, measured from the east wall, there was a tin. She wrote that the tin contained documentation that was separate from the notebooks, and that was the documentation she considered most significant, and that she had kept separately for reasons she explained in a letter inside the tin. Constance looked up from the third notebook. She looked at Rebecca. Rebecca said, "What?" Constance said there was a tin under the kitchen floor. They found the fourth floorboard from the stove. It was fitted with the same precision as the surrounding boards and was not identifiable by anything except knowing which one it was. Rebecca, who had brought a small toolkit in her car with the practical forethought of someone who had assessed the situation and anticipated that tools might be needed, had a flathead screwdriver that fit under the board's edge with persuasion. The board came up. The tin was there. It was a standard storage tin, the kind available at any general store, fitted with a lid that sealed when pressed, and that had done its job of keeping the contents dry and intact in the years since Helen had placed it there. Constance opened it. Inside was a letter, folded in thirds, and beneath the letter, a folder of documents. She read the letter first. Helen had been in correspondence for 11 years, the letter said, with a botanical research institute in the Northeast that had expressed significant interest in several of the compounds she had documented in her notebooks. The correspondence had been productive and had reached, in the 2 years before Helen's health had declined, a point where the Institute had proposed a formal research partnership that would have involved an assessment of Helen's documented work and a potential licensing arrangement for the compounds she had identified. The health decline had interrupted the process before the assessment had been completed. Helen had not been able to continue the correspondence from the care facility with the focus it required. The Institute contact, a researcher named Dr. Francis Obie, had written 3 times during Helen's time in the care facility, and Helen had been unable to respond adequately. Helen believed the correspondence should be resumed. She wrote that the folder contained all of the correspondence with the Institute and Dr. Obie's contact information and the most recent proposal document that the Institute had sent, which described the terms of the potential partnership as they had been discussed before the process was interrupted. She wrote that whoever found the tin should read the proposal document carefully and contact Dr. Obi and tell her that the research continued. Constance read the letter twice. Then she opened the folder. She read the proposal document in the kitchen of the cabin with the February light coming through the window and Rebecca sitting across the table, waiting with the patient quiet she had inherited from her mother. The proposal document was 12 pages long and described, in the careful language of institutional research proposals, what the Institute believed Helen's documented compounds represented in terms of potential commercial and medical application. The language was measured and specific and did not make promises, but described ranges and possibilities and the established research context that made the identified compounds significant. The financial terms described in the proposal document were in the section near the end. Constance read the financial terms. She read them again. She set the document on the table. Rebecca said, "What does it say?" Constance said it said that if the compound identification in Helen's notebooks was confirmed by the Institute's assessment, the licensing arrangement they were proposing would generate a specific annual figure for the holder of the documentation rights. She said the figure. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was not a small figure." Constance said it was not a small figure. She looked at the tin and the letter and the folder and the proposal document and the 3 notebooks on the table beside them and the cabin around her, the wood-burning stove and the bookshelves and the hand pump at the kitchen sink and the porch with the railing that needed attention and the lake visible through the window in the February morning. She thought about Leon's 6-page document on her phone, the organized columns of what 19 years of shared life looked like when it was divided. $212 and a car. She thought about 10 raffle tickets at $2 each that Rebecca had bought as a Christmas present and that she had forgotten about entirely. She thought about Helen Marsh writing on the first page of the 3rd notebook that she was leaving the work to whoever came to it through the raffle, because the right person would be someone who had not sought the thing specifically and would therefore come to it without the assumptions that seeking produced. Constance had not sought it. She had been sitting at a kitchen table reading a 6-page document when the phone rang. She looked at Dr. Francis Obi's contact information in the folder. She picked up her phone. She said to Rebecca that she was going to make a call and that it might take a while and that she would explain everything properly afterward. Rebecca said she was not going anywhere. Constance dialed the number. It rang 4 times and then connected, and a woman answered with the alert manner of someone whose professional attention arrived fully assembled rather than gradually. Constance said her name. She said she was calling from a cabin on Spruce Lake Road and that she was the new owner of the property and the documentation that had previously belonged to Helen Marsh. She said she had found the tin under the kitchen floor. She said she had read the proposal document and the correspondence, and she was calling to tell Dr. Obi that the research continued. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Francis Obi said, in a voice that had shifted from professional readiness to something warmer and more specific, that she had hoped someone would call. She said she had been hoping for 3 years. Constance looked out the cabin window at Spruce Lake in the February morning, gray and still and patient, The way things that had been waiting a long time were patient. She was 72 years old. She had been divided from 19 years of shared life by a 6-page document and had won a 500-square-foot cabin in a raffle on the same afternoon and had found a tin under a kitchen floorboard and was now on the phone with a researcher who had been hoping someone would call for 3 years. She said she was sorry it had taken so long. She said she was here now. Dr. Obi said that was what mattered. They began to talk. Outside the window, Spruce Lake held its February stillness. Inside the cabin, something that had been waiting for 3 years was waiting no longer. Constance talked and listened and took notes in the margin of the third notebook, beside Helen's careful handwriting, in the specific way of a woman who had spent a lifetime knowing how to begin a thing from wherever she was standing when the beginning became necessary. She was standing in a one cabin with $212 and a phone and 40 years of another woman's serious work under her hands. It was enough. It was more than enough. She kept talking.